So when you look at the future, Keidi, do you see a very clear pathway?
Yes, this is why I study scientific futurism, which is all about details across 17 different analytical disciplines, scientific analytical disciplines that give you clarity on all 17 of them. And then you merge them all into one broad based understanding of where the world is going, where society is going. Here's the thing though, because we can draw a parallel between that clarity of where it's going and health, the health research. With the health amount of health research that I have put forward, I see an absolutely clear pathway to longevity, healthy lifespan, anti-aging, and healing and prevention of chronic diseases. But the problem is no matter how great the clarity that I get, no matter how many classes I teach on this, the reality is that the larger population and my extended group of associates keeps getting sicker. So therefore, we have a dilemma. We have the knowledge to save ourselves, but we do not have the cooperative, collaborative will to use that knowledge to save ourselves.
Let me ask you this question. Um, you said earlier, before we started recording, you said earlier that we need a common enemy to create some kind of bond between disparate groups. My question would be, what would be the enemy we need to allow us to effectively drop our individual sectarian affiliations and just say we're gonna move shoulder to shoulder, go forward and become the very best versions of ourselves to make whatever we need to make better. What would the enemy need to be? Who would that enemy need to be?
From my perspective, the highest motivation of them all is to save the babies, save the children. So therefore, if it were up to me to be on the group of social engineers in this mastermind to create a plan to unite our people against a common enemy, I would focus on the engineers of population control, the baby killers. And when we look at the baby killers and expose them, for many people, ideologically, philosophically, they're repulsive, repugnant at the highest degree. The problem is that the baby killers continue to do their work year after year, generation after generation, to the point now that they have essentially eliminated the future for Africans in many parts of the diaspora, UK and United States included amongst that. They have eliminated the possibility of our thriving for another century in the United States. That was the subject of my book, Fade to Black, The Passing of a Great Race. But in my mind, brother, the most repugnant enemy of us all are the baby killers.
Now define what a baby killer means, because in my mind, I've got two definitions running in my head. When you say
Mm-hmm.
baby killers, what are you exactly saying?
Number one would be abortion.
Okay. Hmm.
Beyond that would be the ones who sell toxic food that's causing chronic diseases, causing cancer rates to rise, rise of mental illness, psychiatric chemical imbalances in the brain, the ones who create a dumbing down education system when they have been charged with a duty of creating an education system to turn our children into reasonable, productive, adjusted citizens. These children, these demonic ones, are what I call the baby killers. Now, you had mentioned about that quote, and if we want, can we get this quote that I just shared with you a second ago? I'm not going to read the whole thing. Can
Absolutely.
I put this in the record? On the eve of the 21st century, I published a book entitled The Road to Power, 7 Steps to an African Global Order. I'm reading from the chapter entitled the clash of civilizations and the remaking of world order. Quoting from Samuel P. Huntington's book, to further illustrate the crudeness of the morality of survival axiom, within Huntington's book, in a chapter entitled The New Era in World Politics, he quotes an idea put forward in a novel by Michael Didbin, Dead Lagoon. He recites the following shocker, to which he adds his clarification. There can be no true friends without true enemies. Unless we hate what we are not, we cannot love what we are. These are the old truths we are painfully rediscovering after a century and more of sentimental cant. Those who deny them deny their family, their heritage, their culture, their birthright, their very selves. They will not lightly be forgiven. The unfortunate truth in these old truths cannot be ignored by statesmen and scholars. For people seeking identity and reinventing ethnicity, enemies are essential. And the potentially most dangerous enmities occur across the fault lines between the world's major civilizations. So I share that quote, and it goes on. I can stop sharing at this particular point. But we understand now how we can use some of these very paradigms that the Europeans used to unite themselves to the point where they can conquer the part of the planet which they represent 5% of the world's population and can dominate the entirety of the planet. And we're talking about the British colonial empire. We are now coming to the fact of the matter. We're going to have to realize painting that garbage ideology, that destructive morality off this planet is going to require some pretty deliberate survival modalities, survival motivations. And the sooner we get to this cleansing of this planet, of this toxicity of European imperialism, the better off will be our children's children, so they can reset and create the kind of world that we envision, which is the very theme of the African Union document, Agenda 2063, the Africa that we want.
I was listening to Ibrahim Traore, who is the president of Burkina Faso. He described a triangle. At the top of the triangle, he said, were the European colonialists. And he's basically telling you how they see the world. Yeah. He said that they see the world that the top part of the triangle, that's the good empire, the top bit of the triangle. And then he said at the bottom end of the triangle is the bad empire. And he's referring to the Muslim nations, Middle East, North Africa, the Muslim empire. And then he says there is another empire at the bottom, another bit of the triangle at the bottom, and he describes that as the slave empire. And as the Europeans see the world, their job is to stay at the top and receive all the fruits and the benefits of the whole planet. So all the world's resources belong to the top part of the triangle. It belongs to them. Africa belongs to them. Everybody's country belongs to them. Top of the triangle. And they're the Europeans, the European elite. And then he says that their enemy would be, in his analysis, the Muslim nations. And then he then said that Africa and maybe Black Americans and the Caribbeans represent the slave part of that. So in other words, from their point of view, the Black people are considered to be the resource that they can use to empower themselves and enrich themselves. When you listen to that analysis, what comes to your mind? Is he on the money, or does that need some addition for further clarity?
Ibrahim Traore is undeniably one of the most brilliant young leaders in the world of today and of the past half century, no doubt. I, though, see the limitations of his perspective because he's viewing this from the perspective of a recently freed population and the leader of a recently freed population, he cannot help but see that what they just liberated themselves from represents the pinnacle of power. I want to rethink our people to go back to when Africans held the primary power on this planet. And this takes me to another one of my books, the book entitled Conspiracies and High Crimes, and to the chapter called Secret Societies and Ceremonial Magic. I want to share, and I don't have this pulled up on the screen, but I want to share a few paragraphs of this. But this chapter has numerous quotes about who these people originated from. Before they had power over the world, they came to Africa, and we were the teachers. Let me put this into context. I'm going to begin on page 50. Some months ago, in attempting to explain the motivation underlying the use of esoteric mysticism in rap and hip hop videos, I came across a passage in Manly Palmer Hall's book, Secret Teachings of All Ages, within a chapter entitled Ceremonial Magic and Sorcery. In it, Hall was attempting to communicate the evolution of, quote, black magicians, unquote, whose practice of invoking unseen force had been focus of no small number of secret orders throughout time. Hall traced these rituals to the most ancient of metaphysical sciences, which emerged from Africa's golden age. Quoting from Hall's book, ceremonial magic is the ancient art of invoking and controlling spirits by a scientific application of certain formula. A magician, enveloped in sanctified vestments and carrying a wand inscribed with hieroglyphic figures, could, by the power vested in certain words and symbols, control the invisible inhabitants of the elements and of the astral world. While the elaborate ceremonial magic of antiquity was not necessarily evil, there arose from its perversion several false schools of sorcery or black magic. I'm going to skip my commentary between these different passages. My commentary puts them all into context, but I want to go to the shockers. Mm-hmm. The next quote I cite. Lastly, he notes that modern adaptations of this ancient mystical science bastardize the knowledge for application toward evil ends or black magic, which some might term as, quote, white sorcery. Manly Palmer Hall continues. Egypt, a great center of learning and the birthplace of many arts and sciences, furnished an ideal environment for transcendental experimentation. Here, the black magicians of Atlantis continued to exercise their superhuman powers until they had completely undermined and corrupted the morals of the more primitive, he writes the word primitive, I say it's primitive, mysteries system. By establishing a sacerdotal caste, they usurped the position formerly occupied by the initiates and seized the reins of spiritual government. Thus, black magic dictated the state religion and paralyzed the intellectual and spiritual activities of the individual by demanding his complete and unhesitating acquiescence in the dogma formulated by the priestcraft. The pharaoh became a puppet in the hands of the Scarlet Council, a committee of arch sorcerers elevated to power by the priesthood. Now, this is all real important. Just one part of my analysis, when he mentions the, quote, black magicians of Atlantis, unquote, I interpret that to mean the evil sorcerers of the Mediterranean island states, which, like Greece, gained much of their advanced scientific knowledge from their geographic proximity to the Nile Valley. And breaking apart from my analysis of what he said, That points us to a group that my new analysis is pointing out ever more and more, and that is the legacy of the 8 Jewish families that run the world. We're talking about the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, and others of that ilk. When he alludes to how they use their, quote, superhuman powers, unquote, to undermine, quote, the morals of the primitive mysteries, unquote, it should be interpreted to mean that some who were taught this ancient and scientific knowledge of esoteric wisdom approached it from a corrupted moral value system, which became destructive to the original order. He said also, from my analysis, he said, thus the Pharaoh, which is the king or queen within each of us, became captive to the witches of the Scarlet Council, a satanic oath initiation of an elite group of master magicians. These arch sorcerers who have been anointed by their fellows in the mass media captivate us with their evil magic, which we receive through movies, television, recorded music, the arts, and throughout mass communications. Now, going back to Manly Palmer, these theories, as revealed by Manly Palmer Hall, should not be taken lightly. He continues, these sorcerers then began the systematic destruction of all keys to the ancient wisdom so that none might have access to the knowledge necessary to reach adeptship without first becoming one of their order. They mutilated the rituals of the mysteries while professing to preserve them, so that even though the neophyte passed through the degrees, he could not secure the knowledge to which he was entitled. Idolatry was introduced by encouraging the worship of the images which in the beginning the wise had erected solely as symbols for study and meditation. False interpretations were given to the emblems and figures of the mysteries, and elaborate theologies were created to confuse the minds of their devotees. The masses, deprived of their birthright of understanding and groveling in ignorance, eventually became the abject slaves of the spiritual impostors. Superstition universally prevailed, and the black magicians completely dominated national affairs, with the result that humanity still suffers from the sophistries of the priestcrafts of Atlantis and Egypt. And that, I'll just go ahead and pause right now in case you have any comment you would want to share about what I've been reading from Secret Societies and Ceremonial Magic.
Before I go there, all of what you said was an answer to Ibrahim Traore's triangular analysis of the world. So with all of what you've just said, how would you summarize that his vision is not wide enough to fix the complete problem?
Because it doesn't go to the origins of these ones who took over his country. What I am describing is the origins of the ones that came to dominate after the Berlin Conference. And those people came to dominate because they had access to the global finance system, usury on a massive scale. And that it was the Zionist Ashkenazim money finance system that arose out of the corruption of the mysteries and was able to take over the world's economy that then financed the colonial empowerment or the colonial imperialist schemes. This tells you where they originated from, these arch sorcerers who still continue to lie. They created this massive lie called Moses and the Exodus, and this massive lie that God promised them that whole region that they're now referring to as Greater Israel. They're actually scheming right now to go back in and take the Nile Valley and the Delta over to recapture or to capture, not recapture, even though the lands have been battled over many times over millennia. That was what I was researching today. But they want the pyramids back. They want the Giza Plateau. They want the Nile Valley Delta under their control again. And these people faked the story of their being born as a historical people in the Nile Valley. The entire story of Moses and Exodus is a complete and total fabrication.
There's a few
So,
directions I can go after all of
mm-hmm,
that, but I want to just for the audience listening to this, after we started recording, I said that when I look at European civilization, in fact, before I go there, I was saying that if the African diaspora was to go to the very best versions of themselves, so
mm-hmm,
that they was to live up to the very best of what they are. So therefore, what when you become when you effectively say you are African or you're African or diasporan African, what you're basically saying is that you are the very best of whatever humanity is. So you're the best at science, you're the best in physicality, you're the best and spiritually, you're the very best, right?
mm-hmm,
And to go back to that, I was suggesting that all of us understand the foundation of where African civilization really started in
mm-hmm,
in recorded times. Let me go there, recorded times.
mm-hmm,
And then I said to you that my reading of European civilization, Europeans now, and I'm talking white Europeans, at the top of their civilization, if you draw this triangle, you've got the Freemasons and what they're learning. Okay. And because of my exposure to that world for a time, and I won't go any further than that, but my exposure to that world led me to realize that the top of their triangle is Black Africa.
that's
In
right.
other words, their pinnacle is not Europe, their pinnacle is Egypt. And not Egypt, where after the invasion of the Arabs or the invasion of the
The
Ptolemaic
Romans and the
dynasty
Greeks and
or the
everyone else.
Romans or even the Persians. We're talking about
Mm-hmm,
Egypt in the hands of black people when they
that's right.
were ruled by dynasties prior to the 18th dynasty, which was their peak, but prior to that. That is the peak of European civilization. That's the peak. And that is why, and when you think about it, I used to also wonder, you know, the current Muslims in Egypt have inherited Egyptian artifacts, the land of Egypt. They've inherited it through warfare and occupation. And
Mm-hmm,
there was a season where Europeans were so desirous of going back there, digging things up, and bringing it back to Europe. And because from the Muslim perspective, all of that stuff was haram, and it was nothing to do with Islam, they were very willing to just send it all back. And because there was so much money in it, the Egyptians kind of said, let's kind of work with this, even though from their point of view, the Egyptian religion is all haram, all of it's haram from their point of view. But because there's money there, and the whole world, the elite world, um, all has their foundation of the top of their pyramid is centered there. Because of
mm-hmm.
that, they're now taking advantage of this interest from America, from Europe, in Egypt, and they're going there. But all of that, when I studied it, all of that is our stuff.
That's right.
All of it. And when I
And
say
it's come
ours,
under the control of these external groups that do not value what we valued in it when we ruled the world. That indicates, isn't it, doesn't it, that we're going to have to go back and value our own creations before we can even attempt to get our power back?
absolutely. And I was even sharing with you that I was quite taken. I found it quite interesting when I was listening to a Francophone African who was basically saying that the pinnacle of Africanness in their world was to be a Frenchman.
They want to dress
Right.
like a Frenchman?
To be a Frenchman in
Mm-hmm.
habits and morality and whatever, that was in the mind of this Francophone African. So the very best of Africanness was to be a Frenchman, effectively, because French held the standard. And what I found amazing is that the French themselves don't see themselves at the top of the pyramid. They see Egypt and Africa as top of the pyramid. So you've got this Francophone African seeing France as the top, and France seeing Africa as the top. And I
Now, is that Frenchman who sees Africa at the top? Are they going to teach that African to bypass them and go back to
one
their own origins?
100% the French won't do that because the French want the Francophone Africans see them as the top, and therefore they will see the Frenchman with the crown. But what I found fascinating, like I said, when you go back to Freemasonry within Europe, it all goes back to Egypt, and it goes back
That's
to
right.
the old pharaonic systems. And I just found it fascinating that all of that, because of the invasions of the Persians and the Syrians and the Greeks and the Romans and later on the Muslims, all of that information just got spread out. Some in Africa, some even in India, some in China, and lots of it in Europe, and from Europe into America. And even before Europeans went to America, it was in America already, because you
Hmm.
had Egyptian influence in America way before European. I can't even say discovery, but the Europeans, figuring out how to cross the Atlantic Ocean.
Well,
Um,
the earliest great civilization in the Western Hemisphere are the Olmecs,
yes, they
and
are.
the Olmecs trace directly back to the sailing of numerous African voyages into the Western Hemisphere and leaving their legacy there.
And they were coming from West Africa. And it's funny actually. And also Ivan van Sertima said that when the Spanish first went to the Caribbean and they were speaking to natives, they found that there was a gold spear tip that was identical to what was being made in Guinea, I believe at the time he was quoting, or somewhere in the in West Africa.
Hmm.
And he was essentially saying that even the Europeans knew Africans were in America. And I don't mean Africans who were black people who were living in America all along, the ones that there was trade and
Hmm.
going on between Africa and the Americas for thousands of years,
That's right.
thousands of years. And there was evidence of it when Christopher Columbus turned up and he wrote about it. So it's not as though he
That's
didn't
right.
know. He saw them. They're in Panama, they're in the Caribbean, they're in America, they're in Mexico, they were all over. And I believe
But who
Louisiana was a spot as well where there was a lot of African evidence of Africans being in America for thousands of years. Are you going to say?
but who financed Christopher Columbus's voyages?
I believe it was Isabella and Ferdinand, the king and queen of Spain at the time.
Well, and also the Romans or the Italians had a lot to do with that. And the Romans, I don't think any group of Europeans has ever covered up more of the world's true history than the Catholic Church and the Catholic establishment.
I was going to say when you said the Romans, I would have said to you, I would have pointed specifically to the Vatican
The
because
Catholics.
it was the Vatican and the Pope who specifically asked the King and Queen of Spain
To
um,
finance the trip.
to effectively deal with the Moors,
Hmm.
get rid of them, number one. And in 1492, they got rid of them. And then he effectively said, deal with them in their bases. And their base would have been Africa. But then they were
That's
also
right.
told that there was a base of them in America. And that's what motivated them to go into America with their conquistadors, which means the conquerors, to go and conquer the Moorish base in Americas and the Moorish bases in Africa. And that's what motivated them to go around the world. Because when you think about it, why did Europe in the 1400s, late 1400s, early 1500s, decide at that moment in history and no other time before to then go around the world spreading their legacy, spreading their ideas, going doing trade, and spreading also their DNA and their genes all over the world? What motivated that? And that initial motivation came about, you can go to the Pope at that time.
Hmm. Yeah. And a lot of it has to do with the level of industrial revolution that's taking place, that now they have the ability to use industrial processes to manufacture all of these boats, put their surplus men with weapons on these boats, and go out and conquer in the name of their motherland. I want to share one more brief excerpt from this. And here, bear with me. I'm going to share one more brief excerpt from this, quoting from Manly Palmer Hall's book. I think this one kind of summarizes everything I've shared so far. And let me set it up. Who could be the ones that pulled off this dastardly historical crime? Hall gives us clear idea of their delineation in the next paragraph of his fascinating chapter. Quote, fully convinced that their scriptures sanctioned it, numerous medieval Kabbalists devoted their lives to the practice of ceremonial magic. The transcendentalism of the Kabbalists is founded upon the ancient and magical formula of King Solomon, who has long been considered by the Jews as the prince of ceremonial magicians. Among the Kabbalists of the Middle Ages were a great number of black magicians who strayed from the noble concepts of the Sefer Yetzirah and became enmeshed in demonism and witchcraft. They sought to substitute magic mirrors, consecrated daggers, and circles spread around posts of coffin nails for the living of the virtuous life, which, without the assistance of complicated rituals or sub-mundane creatures, unfailingly brings man to the state of true individual completion. And so we understand now their religious texts sanctified it. These are the same ones who said God gave us this whole region, and they're committing genocide on massive scale today. And for the last 2 years, we see the latest episode. These people of the Solomonic lineage, the Abrahamic religion, these are the possessors now of this evil witchcraft, evil legacy that has dominated the world. And because now they control nuclear weapons, they put the whole world in danger of the annihilation of humanity.
Let me share this with you. Again, when I go back to my reading of history and my reading of how civilizations thought of themselves and how they saw what was their organizing principle. For them, the top of their pyramid was God. Okay, and depending on where they were, or Elohim, and depending on where they were, they would have their own Elohim. So the Elohim of the ancient Israelites was, we know, Yahweh. Okay, but they didn't start with just Yahweh, they had others. And as far as I know, the Kabbalistic traditions didn't start with them. It started with the Canaanites. And as you know, the Israelites moved into Canaanite lands. And so when they moved into Canaanite lands, they got exposed to the Kabbalistic traditions. And then they made it part of it was part of the mystic Jewish models, which is still there today. And I remember someone introduced me to there's a place called the Kabbalah Center in the UK, in London. And someone introduced me to going there. And I was quite surprised, Keidi, when I was there during their, whatever, it looked like I was walking into a synagogue, specifically a synagogue. On the left-hand side were seated all the men. On the right-hand side, and now that's from the position of us looking at the stage. Left-hand side for the men. On the right hand, there's an aisle. On the right-hand side were all the women. Okay, and then you had this rabbi at the front doing his thing, speaking partly in Hebrew and partly in English. And on the left-hand side with the men was one woman and her daughter. Guess who that woman was? And I was sat right next to her, by the way, because when I turned up late, I ended up sitting basically right next to her. Who was that woman who was on the male side of the Kabbalah Center in London? Have a guess.
Margaret Thatcher?
Madonna.
Oh, so
Madonna.
why was she sitting on the opposite side? Was she an outcast? Well, I do know the Madonna, she studied Kabbalism.
100. I'm telling you, I saw her there. I met the
Hmm.
lady right there and then. But and at the time, she was married to Guy Ritchie. So she was still married to Guy Ritchie at the time. And her daughter was still a little girl at the time. I sat right next to Madonna. Okay. And I found, and the reasons why she was on the male side was because she gave millions of pounds to the development of the building, and the building is a beautiful building, right? But she
Hmm.
spent millions of pounds, so they made her an honorary male. Okay, so she wasn't sitting with Guy Ritchie. Guy Ritchie was like to the far left of the left side, and she was on the
Hmm.
right side near the aisle, but on the male side. And I sat next to her because like, obviously I turned up, relatively late. But when I turned up, I was literally what looked, to all intents and purposes, looked like a synagogue. There was Jewish,
Hmm.
all of them. And then when I walked in, they gave me a kippah because I had to wear the kippah to be in that location. Do you see what I mean? Even though I was a guest, I had to wear the kippah. So I turned up looking like I was Jewish as well.
Hmm.
And that's when I realized that, my reading of the Kabbalah and its influence on mystical Judaism, I saw it with my own eyes. When I walked into the Kabbalah Center, there was no Christians, there were no Catholics, they were all Jews in that place. Um,
Hmm.
anyway, but to go back to, I find it just fascinating when I do look at um, how do we go forward in a way where we almost take control of how we see ourselves and then teach our children to be the very best version of themselves, because I genuinely believe that if we was to literally just be the very best version of ourselves and take control of our own communities, I think we would actually outperform every other community. I think we'd outperform them
Yeah, we're
on
going to
every level.
realize, we have to realize the strangulation that European religions have on African ambition.
Yes, and I would even go one step further. And I hate to say this openly on this forum right now, but I think an umbrella that blocks us from our true potential, one of the things that's blocking us in our minds is Christianity. And
European Christianity.
European Christianity. Another umbrella is Islam. It's a block. It stops
Hmm.
you from being the very best version of yourself and seeing your others as brothers. Black Christians do not see black Muslims as their brothers. But
And
prior to Islam and prior to Christianity turning up in Egypt, in Africa, and when would this have happened? Let's go back 1000 BC. Keep it simple. 1000 BC, there was no Christianity in Europe, in Africa. There was no Islam in Africa, and yet they ruled the world. And then at some point, when the Muslims took over Egypt, Egypt never ruled the world again. In fact, when it was taken over by outsiders, Egypt was never as powerful ever again. And if you
hmm
look at the old maps, Israel going into Lebanon, um, also going into Egypt and going down into Sudan. All of that land was the Egyptian Empire, all of it. And specifically, the king that ruled during that time was Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty. He literally
check.
ruled all of that. So Israel
Hmm.
wasn't even outside of Egypt. Israel was part of the Egyptian Empire. And as far
That's
as
right.
I know, when they kicked out the so-called Hyksos or the Hyksos remnants, the outsiders, uh,
Hmm.
they basically put them in the northern part of their territory, which is basically Israel today. They put them there almost like a buffer so that when outsiders came in, they met them first. And they took
Hmm.
that land. So here's what I thought, because as you know, during that time, Pharaoh was considered to be a god. He was a god king in their in their
That's right.
in their belief system. And so when the Jews say that God gave them that land, I wonder, was that God Thutmose III? Or was that God somebody else? Now I know their mythology says that God gave it to Abraham, and Abraham would have been about what 2000 BC, and he would have been part of the Hyksos invasion around the 13th dynasty. However, I do wonder, why it was that it was Tutmos putting them there, and or that dynasty
Hmm.
putting them there. Is that where they got the authority from to have that spot?
No,
Tell me more then.
because they didn't exist until much, much later.
I,
They're
I
claiming a
know the
history.
mythology. No, no, no. Listen, the mythology came in later on to claim that, and the white Jews. I'm not talking about the white Jews. I'm talking about the black Jews. But the mythology to claim that spot is in the Bible for definite. So now you can tell me when the Bible started to say that was their land. When do you say that happened?
I don't like to answer questions about the Bible. I'm not an authority of it. I can cite it from time to time, but I don't like to because I regard the Bible as just chaos.
Okay. So what then?
Anything's justified in the Bible.
So what
Anything.
then? Yeah, but what then gives the Jewish people the idea that that land belongs to them? Where's the idea come from?
Conquest, military conquest. The these people are not of that origin. They're not Sephardic. With Sephardic Hebrews, Habaru, have been across that region for at least 1,000 years, maybe, oh, I know, at least 2,000 or so years, maybe 3,000 or more. They've been across that region. They come out of Ethiopia. They were in Ethiopia. There was no Jewish exodus from Egypt. That's a complete and total mythology. You did not have 40,000 people cross the Sinai Desert for 40 years and leave no footprint. An absurdity. These people came in from the Russian steppes, where we have to understand the Russian steppes is a crossroads of three major civilizations. You have the uh, Aryans coming out of Egypt through Persia. Those are the Aryans. And they were very hostile, very conquering people. You have the Mongols coming out of the Russian steppes. They were very hostile, very conquering people. And then you have the Africans, and you talked about Tutmos the Third, who is a conqueror coming out of Africa. And so this whole Western Asian region, so-called Middle East, or some have called it the Fertile Crescent, is therefore the basis, the center of most of the world's antagonisms and warfare, since these groups grew larger than could be contained by the natural geography. So therefore, this group of Russians, Khazarians, comes south, and they don't come as conquerors. They come as traders, and they discover this magnificent story of this great people, the Israelites or the Habaru, the Hebrews. And then they go back to their place and they say, well, not only are we trading, but look what we brought. We brought this magnificent story, and we're claiming that as our story because it was such an inspiring story. They claimed it. And then later, when they were pushed out of the area by the rise of the Turks and in the origins of the Ottoman Empire, when they were pushed out of the area, they scattered. Some of them went north into Slavic territories, into Poland, and they went as far as Western Europe, into France, etc. And eventually they just claimed the story that was not their own story. I have a study I did on that not too long ago. I thought it was pretty interesting story. I don't really have it committed to memory, but they're fakers. They're
I
some of the
agree.
biggest fakers in history.
There's a book called The 13th Tribe, which describes exactly
Hmm.
what you said. Now, just so we got the timeline correct, because you said three things there, and they're not related in terms of time. And so if we look at Thutmose III, we're looking at 1300 BC,
That's
BC,
correct.
1300 BC, and before. Between 14 and 1300 BC is Thutmose III. We're looking at the Mongolians pouring in and effectively taking over Islam. And we're looking at
Hmm.
around what, 1300 AD, AD that takes
Hmm.
place and before. And then the Khazarian would have been around the time, around the same time, around
Hmm.
12, 1300 AD. And so when you said Tutmos was there, it sounded like the Khazarians met Tutmos, and no, that never happened because there's like a
Yeah, yeah, I
2000,
agree.
there are
Because
2000
that
countries.
would have been during the New Kingdom period of of Tarseti.
Doesn't Tarseti predate all of that?
Well, Tarseti predates by that wouldn't be the that would be Kemet at that point, the Middle Kingdom.
That's right. But anyway, so to go back to what you're saying, everything you said was described in the 13th tribe, that these Khazarians then adopted Judaism and then
Hmm.
they made themselves the effectively the inheritors of the Abrahamic tradition, and they made themselves the Jews. And because they were a warlike nation, they effectively took on board, you know, what warlike activities and took over trade as well. And they could protect their trade because they were warlike. And believe it or not, guess who the Rothschilds come from?
They come from the Ashkenazim.
They're from the Khazarians, the
Yeah,
Ashkenazi
the
Khazarians.
Khazarians, the Ashkenazim are the Khazarians once
Correct.
they've merged themselves into European cultures.
That's because they spread out, because
That's
it
right.
was the Mongolians who kind of, dispersed them. And so, and that's, and,
And I think it
and
was
the
the
Ottoman
Turks.
Empire.
I think it was the Turks that dispersed them.
That's right, the Ottoman Empire. And so the
Hmm.
Turks took over the no, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and this would have been around 900 AD, around that time when they started to interfere with, because Rome was in two sides. You had the western part of Rome and the eastern part.
Hmm.
And the eastern part was based in Turkey, and the western part was based in Rome, Italy. And the Roman side fell around 500 AD, and I think around 900 AD is when the eastern side fell, and that's when that side kind of fell apart. And so then you had this Muslim Christian kind of, you know, and I'm very suspicious about that, what was going on that side as well. I have a feeling that the eastern part of the Roman Empire effectively used Islam as their army effectively to reconquer territory that was theirs. That was part of the Roman Empire. That's where my mind is leading me to believe. So Islam isn't this independent thing. I think Islam is part of the whole
Hmm.
Roman
Yeah,
Empire
and
trying to
recognizing
reassemble itself.
all three of them claim to be the same Abrahamic tradition or
That's
Abrahamic
that's that's
tradition.
the glue that holds them together.
Right. That's right.
Which means at some point in the future they could see themselves as all being brothers and sisters because they're all the children of Abraham.
But then again, they've never been able to get over that war-mongering core, which is at the heart of all three of those religions. They claim to be spiritual people, but they are the biggest killers in modern world history.
They are. They are.
So,
So to go back
so
to the earlier thing we were talking about, what is the glue then that holds us together so that we can then prosper and keep at bay those who just want to interfere with our progress? What's the glue that holds us together?
the fact that we have a common enemy, unless I can go back to that quote from Michael Didman, unless we hate that which we are not, we cannot learn to love that which we are. And so, therefore, having that understanding that we have this powerful common enemy, then we're going to be forever acting like a dispersed people and easily manipulated and controlled by whatever version of the Stockholm syndrome feeds the false set of values that we have adopted. It's culture. If we're looking for a simple one word explanation of what will bring us together to find our strength, it's culture.
Keely,
Then we can describe the culture in many more words.
I want you to tell us about this book called Disaster Preparedness for World War Five and Six. That
All
specific
right.
book, what is the key ideas that you are sharing in that book, and what's the conclusions of it?
On the back cover, I have this paragraph that gives us a pretty good synopsis of what the book is intended to do.
Can you show us the cover?
Okay, here's the front cover of the book while I read the back cover. How is the global economic order shaping up for the 21st century? Today, we are forced to consider how the average working family might prepare for the next two global conflicts that we see arising. We have relied on government and media to describe global affairs, but now we present a different narrative regarding these world wars. Using scientific futurism, we look over the horizon as we simultaneously examine the history of conflict from the 20th century forward. What can we do to protect ourselves? And the conclusion is disaster preparedness for World Wars 5 and 6. We have to understand the nature of these global wars, and we have to appropriately respond to these threats and prepare ourselves for these great disasters. That leads us through chapter after chapter with the book, the chapter we had talked about at the beginning of the conversation, Game Theory for Master's Level Study.
Okay, so we've got a book called Disaster Preparedness for World Wars 5 and 6 by Keidi Awadu. This book, you'll find an analysis that Ibrahim Johore should be studying and reading so he can get a bigger picture than he is presenting, to allow himself and the rest of Africa to coalesce and really to come into the very best versions of themselves, and not be relying on the old colonial masters to be the top of their pyramid, because at the top of the colonial masters pyramid is Africa, and
That's
they
right.
don't know it.
That's right. Well,
While we're
as you
worshipping
know,
them, they're worshipping us.
as you very well know, there are a number of African youth who don't know about the global struggle that Africans have had against the colonial powers, neo-colonialism, imperialism, enslavement, and they don't know that the new global imperialism is being conducted by the corporations who seduce us with buckets of fried chicken, sodas, and flashy cars, and all the accoutrements of petty bourgeoisie consumerism. Now, we are going to have to build within Africa's young population. That's the great beauty. Africa is the youngest population of any region of the world. And with what we know, we should be teaching these young people to not just empower themselves and the motherland continent as a whole, but really to give the world, the whole planet, a new vision of sovereign and sustainable development.
And I think also when I look at the Cresswell-Sing reports, I think what's motivated the world we live in today was their fear of genetic annihilation. And it's their fear that's made them go on this warlike footing to basically destroy everybody else. It's their fear. And that is part of the problem that makes them so destructive. They're afraid.
Frances Cress Welsing did the best she could, and that's to be appreciated, because many others stood on her shoulders as they started to investigate this. But she never mentioned the short phrase, the morality of survival. This
Break that
quote
down.
unquote, this quote unquote fear of genetic annihilation translates to this cruelty called the morality of survival. I tried my best, and unfortunately, Frances Cress Welsing was not open to any other research other than hers and Neely Fuller's. And I'm not going to describe the encounter I had when I tried to hand her some material that I thought she would appreciate, because it was being built in no small part upon that idea of the fear of genetic survival, of the genetic annihilation. I thought she would receive it. She almost acted as if touching my book would be like taking a tissue or a handkerchief from Madonna.
So, without saying anything bad about her, 'cause I don't think we should, let's leave her legacy in pristine condition. What was the idea that, had she heard it, what was the idea you was going to share with her had she heard it?
Well, it was a book that I wrote early on called Another Loaded Needle, the SPF 66 malaria vaccine, and the plot to the conspiracy to decimate the population of Africa. What Francis Cress Welsing never made the connection to Pan-Africanism. And my book laid out that unless we build Pan-Africanism, then the Africans in the various diaspora communities were vulnerable to complete and total decimation. Unfortunately, after 37 years, I think, while she was alive, of her research, we never, from the position of Africans in America, we never stopped our annihilation. We never, ever put a dent in the rate at which we were disappearing. So I thought that the focus is going to have to be repositioned to give us a better chance to engage in survival strategies. We can't just keep doing the same thing, saying the same thing over and over again and expecting some different outcome, some different result. And if my research doesn't produce measurable, tangible outcomes, better strategic plans, then my research is devalued as well.
It's funny, when I look at the chessboard of the games that's being played, for me, I see very clearly a papal command to defeat the Moors in 1490, in 1480s. That command has never been rescinded. That command is still there. So in other words, to enslave us, to use us, and to destroy us has never been taken back. So even though black people are now in the Catholic faith themselves, they are still vulnerable, because at no point did the European elite say that we were not the enemy. We're still the enemy from their point of view. We're still the
Mm-hmm.
enemy. We don't see that we are the enemy. So when they poison us, we don't see it, because we are, like you said earlier, we're suffering from Stockholm syndrome. We're allowing the person who's basically harming us, um, we're being nice to them when we should be protecting ourselves from them.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And we don't see it.
they gave us a religion that told us no matter what they do to us, turn the other cheek
Absolutely. That's
and
part
let
of
them smack
brainwashing.
you again.
That's part of the brainwashing.
For
Yeah.
those who get a chance to hear our conversation, do look for the books, Keidi.biz, and you can see the new book, Disaster Preparedness for World Wars 5 and 6. You can also see the book, Conspiracies and High Crimes. You'll see that one there as well. These should be informative, inspiring, motivating, so that we can kind of breach the walls of constricted thinking that has got us locked up into intergenerational non-competitiveness.
And on that note, thank you very much. See you soon.
Peace, land.